20 million barrels of crude oil pass through the Persian Gulf every single day. If you cut that flow, the global economy halts. That volume relies entirely on the Strait of Hormuz. It is a severe geographical bottleneck. At its narrowest point, the strait spans exactly 21 miles. Every ship exiting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar must navigate this specific corridor. In late February 2026, the diplomatic framework managing the region collapsed. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a preemptive military campaign targeting Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure. On March 1st, an airstrike killed Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps retaliated immediately. They declared the Strait of Hormuz officially closed to all unfriendly nations, backing the declaration with active anti-ship missile locks and swarm boat deployments. Within 48 hours, maritime tanker traffic dropped by 70%. Over 150 commercial vessels dropped anchor on both sides of the strait, waiting for safe passage that would not arrive. By removing 20% of global oil consumption from the market at once, the IRGC created a supply gap twice the size of the 1973 oil crisis. Iran's leadership knew they could not defeat the combined air superiority of the US and Israel in conventional combat. They shifted the battlefield to global economics. The blockade relies on a strategy of mutual assured economic destruction. If domestic infrastructure is under attack, the IRGC will ensure the nations targeting them suffer severe inflation and fuel rationing. The immediate targets of this strategy are neighboring US-allied Gulf states. Washington's military footprint relies heavily on bases hosted by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. By choking off the strait, the IRGC cuts these host nations off from their own primary national revenues. It imposes a direct financial cost on regional powers cooperating with Washington. The secondary layer of the strategy targets neutral powers. Nations like China and India rely heavily on Gulf crude. By starving Asian and European markets of energy, Tehran forces the international community to pressure the US and Israel into a ceasefire. Tehran's strategy utilizes the physical geography of the Gulf to hold global markets until the military campaign is halted. The immediate assumption from policymakers is that Gulf states can simply pump their oil out through overland pipelines, bypassing the hostile waters entirely. The global market is suddenly missing 20 million barrels of daily flow. Saudi Arabia's east-west petroline moves crude to the Red Sea, filling a bypass with 7 million barrels per day. The UAE's Abu Dhabi pipeline adds 1.5 million barrels to our total. That UAE pipeline terminates at the Fujairah port. In active conflict scenarios, drone strikes against this exact terminal can disrupt loadings, making this limited output highly fragile. Adding every available drop from Iraqi bypasses, the total pipeline alternative hard stops at roughly 9.2 million barrels per day. The infrastructure to replace the strait physically does not exist. The global market remains critically short by over 10 million barrels every single day. The next proposed solution involves maritime detours. Ships can simply avoid conflict zones by sailing the long way around the African continent. Routing shipments around the Cape of Good Hope adds up to 14 days of transit time and millions of dollars in fuel and insurance premiums per voyage. However, this detour assumes the vessels are already in open water. It fails to account for the physical location of the cargo itself.
The vast majority of the export infrastructure, the loading terminals, and the idle tankers themselves are physically trapped behind the IRGC blockade inside the Persian Gulf. For liquefied natural gas, the situation is absolute. Qatar is the world's largest LNG exporter, and it has 0 pipeline bypasses. Its entire output is stranded at the docks. Maritime detours offer no relief when the product itself is held hostage inside a geographic cage. With physical bypasses failing, Western nations turn to their final emergency measure, triggering the release of their strategic petroleum reserves. In response to the crisis, the head of the International Energy Agency ordered the largest coordinated reserve drawdown in history. Member nations flood the market with a combined 400 million barrels of stored oil. Against a 20 million barrel daily deficit, that release hits 0 in precisely 20 days, providing roughly 3 weeks of artificial supply. Markets recognize the math immediately. Crude prices spike past $120 a barrel as traders price in the impending supply cliff. Strategic reserves provide roughly 20 days of supply, leaving the global market exposed by month 2. A 90-day closure reaches far beyond the fuel tank. Crude oil provides the carbon and nitrogen inputs required for synthetic materials and global food production. The Middle East operates as a massive, quiet manufacturing hub for critical petrochemicals, specifically exporting millions of tons of ammonia and urea. This graph plots the immediate agricultural impact. Urea is a mandatory component in commercial fertilizers. Within weeks of the blockade, prices spike from $475 to $680 per metric ton. This pricing surge collides directly with the critical spring planting season across the Northern Hemisphere. Farmers are forced to absorb extreme margin pressures or reduce their acreage. Simultaneously, the stranding of Qatari LNG doubles natural gas contracts in Europe. The cost to heat commercial greenhouses for commercial produce surges out of control. Compounding high fertilizer costs with extreme greenhouse heating expenses drives European food inflation rapidly toward 9%. A naval blockade in the Middle East dictates crop yields worldwide, guaranteeing a global food shortage within a single growing season. The contagion moves directly from agriculture into advanced manufacturing. 85% of Middle East polyethylene exports travel through the strait, alongside vital compounds like monoethylene glycol. That specific chemical is irreplaceable for the Asian garment industry. Factories across India, Vietnam, and Indonesia face immediate shortages for synthetic textiles and packaging materials. The high-tech sector follows. The manufacturing of EV battery anodes relies heavily on synthetic graphite. That graphite requires petroleum coke from Gulf refineries. As refiners prioritize fuel output, this coke vanishes, forcing battery assembly lines worldwide to power down. The final vulnerability impacts public health. The global pharmaceutical supply chain relies heavily on petrochemicals. Specific petrochemicals from the Gulf are mandatory for manufacturing life-saving generic medicines in Indian and Chinese labs. A blockaded strait severs that entire supply. This data visualization shows the actual footprint of a 90-day closure. Food production, advanced manufacturing, and global medicine supply chains collapsing simultaneously across multiple continents. A long-term closure of the Strait of Hormuz guarantees the systemic failure of the modern global economy.